In the cold darkness of London's East End, where gaslight flickered against wet cobblestones and fog rolled through narrow alleys like a living creature, a killer walked among the desperate and the damned. The autumn of 1888 brought terror to the streets of Whitechapel, a place already drowning in poverty, disease, and despair. 5 women, maybe more, fell victim to a murderer so cunning, so brutal, and so mysterious that his name would echo through history long after their bodies grew cold. He called himself Jack the Ripper, and in just a few short months, he created a legend that would never die. This is not just a story about murder. This is a story about fear that gripped an entire city, about poor women who became symbols of Victorian suffering, about policemen who chased ghosts through London's darkest corners, and about how one unknown killer changed the way the world thinks about crime forever. More than a century has passed since those terrible nights, yet we still do not know who he was, why he killed, or where he disappeared to when the murders suddenly stopped. This is the entire story of Jack the Ripper, the most famous unsolved mystery in criminal history, a shadow that has haunted humanity for more than 130 years. London in the late 1800s was the largest city on Earth, the beating heart of the British Empire, a place of incredible wealth and unimaginable poverty existing side by side. Queen Victoria sat on her throne, ruling over territories that stretched across every continent, and Britain believed itself to be the most civilized nation in human history. But beneath the grand buildings and the elegant streets where rich people rode in carriages, there existed another London entirely, a hidden world of suffering that polite society chose not to see. The East End was this other London, a maze of overcrowded slums where hundreds of thousands of working poor struggled to survive each day. Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Aldgate, and the surrounding neighborhoods formed a district where desperation was as common as the foul smells that rose from the streets. Families of 8 or 10 people lived together in single rooms with no windows and no sanitation. Disease spread quickly through these cramped spaces, taking children before they could grow and leaving adults weak and sick. The factories and docks provided some work, but never enough, and the wages barely kept people alive. Thousands had no homes at all and slept wherever they could find shelter, in doorways or under bridges or in the common lodging houses that packed people together on dirty beds for just a few pennies a night. Women had the hardest lives of all in this cruel place. Victorian society offered them almost no opportunities to earn honest living. They could work in the factories for wages so low that starvation remained a constant threat, or they could take in laundry and sewing, ruining their eyes and hands for pennies. Many women turned to the streets, selling their bodies to strangers just to earn enough money for a bed and a meal. These prostitutes, whom the Victorians called unfortunates, numbered in the thousands in Whitechapel alone. They ranged in age from teenagers to women in their 40s, though the hard life made even the young ones look old before their time. They worked the dark streets and back alleys, taking clients into shadowy courtyards and empty buildings, always in danger from violent men, from disease, and from the police who could arrest them at any moment. The respectable people of London knew these women existed but preferred not to think about them, treating them as a moral stain rather than as human beings driven to desperate choices by impossible circumstances. Nobody protected them. Nobody cared about them. And when one of them died, the world barely noticed. This was the environment into which Jack the Ripper would emerge, a place already so full of suffering that a few more deaths might have gone unnoticed if not for the shocking brutality of how these women were killed. The police force that served this area was called the Metropolitan Police, and they operated from a station on Leman Street in Whitechapel. These officers walked their beats through dangerous neighborhoods, dealing with drunkenness, theft, and violence every single night. The East End was considered one of the most difficult assignments in all of London because the crime never stopped, and the people often viewed the police as enemies rather than protectors. The detectives who would eventually hunt for the Ripper were experienced men who had seen terrible things before, but nothing in their careers had prepared them for what was coming. Inspector Frederick Aberline, Detective Inspector Edmund Reed, and others worked long hours trying to maintain some order in streets that seemed forever on the edge of chaos. They dealt with gang violence, with robberies, with assaults, and with the occasional murder that occurred when drinking and fighting went too far. But the murders that began in the autumn of 1888 would be different from anything they had encountered before. Crimes so shocking that they would attract attention from the highest levels of government and change the way criminal investigations were conducted forever. The killings that would eventually be attributed to Jack the Ripper may have begun before anyone realized a single killer was at work. In the early months of 1888, several women were attacked in Whitechapel in ways that seemed unusually violent even for that rough neighborhood. On February 7th, a woman named Emma Smith was assaulted by a gang of men who robbed her and injured her so severely that she died the next day. On August 7th, another woman named Martha Tabram was found dead in a building on George Yard, stabbed 39 times with what appeared to be 2 different weapons. The police investigated both deaths as separate incidents, tragic examples of the violence that plagued the East End, but they did not connect them to what would follow. Some historians today believe these women were early victims of the Ripper, while others think they were killed by different perpetrators in unrelated attacks. The truth remains unknown, lost to time, and poor record-keeping. What is certain is that these deaths created an atmosphere of unease in Whitechapel, a sense that something was wrong even before the murders that would define the Ripper case began in earnest. Everything changed in the early morning hours of August 31st, 1888. A woman named Marion Nichols, known to her friends as Polly, was found lying in the street on Bucks Row, a narrow lane near the heart of Whitechapel. A car driver on his way to work discovered her body around 3:40 in the morning, lying on her back near the entrance to a stable yard. At first, he thought she might be drunk or unconscious, common sights in that neighborhood at that hour. But when he approached closer, he realized with horror that her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. Blood pooled around her and soaked in her clothing, though strangely little blood appeared on the ground itself, suggesting she had been killed elsewhere and moved, or that she had died so quickly that her heart had stopped pumping before much blood could flow out. The police were called immediately, and when they examined the body more carefully, they discovered that the killer had done more than just cut her throat. Her abdomen had been slashed open with deep cuts that exposed her intestines, wounds that served no practical purpose but seemed designed to mutilate and destroy. This was not a robbery gone wrong or a fight that had escalated too far. This was something deliberate, something calculated, something that spoke of a mind unlike anything the police had encountered before. Marion Nichols was 43 years old when she died. She had been married once and had 5 children, but her life had fallen apart through a combination of drinking, poverty, and bad luck. She had worked as a servant in various households, but could never keep a job for long. She had lived in workhouses and lodging houses, moving from place to place, always struggling to earn enough money to survive. On the night she died, she had been turned away from a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street because she did not have the 4 pennies needed for a bed. She had laughed it off, telling the lodging house keeper that she would soon earn the money and be back, showing him a new bonnet she had acquired and boasting about how she would easily find a client. She walked into the dark streets of Whitechapel shortly after 1 in the morning, and within a few hours, she was dead. The killer had taken nothing from her except her life. Her few possessions remained with her body, suggesting that robbery had not been the motive. The brutality of the murder shocked even the hardened police officers who had seen many violent deaths. This was personal in some way, driven by anger or hatred or some twisted impulse that normal people could not understand. The investigation into Marion Nichols' death proceeded slowly at first. The police questioned people who lived and worked near Bucks Row, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. They found no witnesses to the actual murder, though several people had seen Nichols walking alone in the hours before her death. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the injuries, showing that the killer had used a long-bladed knife and had possessed enough knowledge of anatomy to make precise cuts. This detail would become important as more murders followed, leading some investigators to suspect that the killer might have medical training or experience working as a butcher. The newspapers reported the murder as a particularly brutal example of East End violence, but it did not immediately capture national attention. Such deaths were unfortunate, but not uncommon in Whitechapel, where life was cheap and violence was a daily reality. Just 8 days later, on September 8th, the killer struck again. A woman named Annie Chapman, known as Dark Annie, was found dead in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street, again in the heart of Whitechapel. A resident of the building discovered her body around 6 in the morning, lying near a fence with her throat cut and her abdomen ripped open in a manner similar to Marion Nichols. But this murder was even more horrific because the killer had taken his time and done things that suggested a specific purpose beyond simple violence. He had removed Annie Chapman's intestines and placed them deliberately over her shoulder. Even more disturbing, he had taken away parts of her body, organs that he cut out and carried off with him as trophies or for some other incomprehensible reason. The precision of these removals reinforced the theory that the killer had anatomical knowledge, that he knew exactly where to cut and how to extract specific organs quickly and efficiently. The location of this murder was also significant because the backyard was accessible from the street but required the killer to work in a confined space where he risked being discovered at any moment. Yet he had completed his terrible work and escaped without anyone seeing him, vanishing into the maze of streets and alleys like smoke dissolving in the wind. Annie Chapman was 47 years old and had lived a life as hard as Marion Nichols. She had been married to a coachman who had supported her financially even after they separated, but when he died, her money stopped and she fell into poverty. She had chronic illnesses that made working difficult, and she had turned to prostitution to survive. On the night before her death, she had been staying at a lodging house on Dorset Street, another of Whitechapel's most notorious locations. Like Nichols, she had been turned away for lack of money and had gone into the streets to earn the few pennies she needed for a bed. A witness saw her talking to a man in the early morning hours near where her body would be found. The witness described this man as slightly over 40 years old, a little taller than Annie herself, dark-complexioned, and wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark coat. He looked like a foreigner, possibly Jewish, according to the witness, though this description must be taken with caution since anti-immigrant prejudice ran strong in Whitechapel and influenced how people perceived and remembered others. This sighting would be one of the few times anyone reported seeing a possible suspect near a victim, but it was not detailed enough to help identify the killer. The two murders so close together created genuine fear in Whitechapel. The police increased patrols in the area, and newspaper coverage intensified dramatically. Reporters descended on the East End, interviewing residents and writing sensational stories about the mysterious killer who could strike without warning and disappear without trace. The murders were linked officially, and investigators acknowledged they were likely dealing with a single perpetrator. The press began calling him the Whitechapel Murderer, and speculation about his identity and motives filled column after column of newsprint. Some writers suggested he was a butcher or a doctor gone mad. Others proposed he was taking revenge on prostitutes for some personal reason. A few even theorized that the killer might be a woman, though this idea never gained much support since the physical strength required for such violent attacks seemed beyond what most Victorian women possessed. The Home Secretary, the government minister responsible for law enforcement, took personal interest in the case and demanded regular updates from the police. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, faced increasing criticism for his force's failure to catch the killer or even develop strong leads. Ordinary people in Whitechapel became frightened to walk alone at night, and the prostitutes who needed to work the streets did so in constant terror, knowing they might be the next victim. On September 27th, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency in London that would change everything about how the public understood and remembered these murders. The letter was written in red ink and addressed to Dear Boss, and it claimed to be from the killer himself. The writer taunted the police, saying he loved his work and would continue killing until he was caught. He promised that his next victim would have her ears cut off, a specific threat that would later seem to come true. Most significantly, he gave himself a name that would echo through history, Jack the Ripper. He signed a letter with this name and added a postscript saying the police should keep the letter back until he did a bit more work, then they could use it. The letter included details about the previous murders and expressed a gleeful enjoyment of the terror he was creating. Whether this letter was genuine or a hoax created by a journalist seeking to sell newspapers remains debated to this day, but its impact was immediate and enormous. The press published the letter, and suddenly the Whitechapel murderer had a name that was both common and terrifying, familiar yet mysterious. Jack could have been anyone, any man walking the streets of London, and the Ripper suggested someone who tore and destroyed with savage abandon. The combination was perfect for creating lasting fear and fascination. 3 days after that letter arrived, on September 30th, Jack the Ripper, if indeed it was the same killer, committed what would become known as the double event, murdering 2 women in a single night within less than an hour of each other. The first victim was a woman named Elizabeth Stride, found in a narrow courtyard off Burner Street around 1 a.m. Her throat had been cut deeply, severing her windpipe and major blood vessels. But unlike the previous victims, her body had not been mutilated. This led investigators to believe the killer had been interrupted before he could complete his work. A man who was driving a horse and cart into the courtyard had discovered the body, still warm and with blood flowing freely, suggesting the murder had occurred just moments before. The killer must have heard the cart approaching and fled immediately, disappointed that he could not finish what he had started with this victim. Within the hour, frustrated and still hungry for violence, he found another woman in Mitre Square, a small enclosed plaza in the city of London, just outside the Whitechapel jurisdiction. Her name was Catherine Eddowes, and the killer made up for his interrupted work on Elizabeth Stride by subjecting Catherine to the most savage mutilation yet seen. Catherine Eddowes' body was discovered by a police constable on his regular patrol at 1:45 in the morning. The officer had walked through Mitre Square just 15 minutes earlier and had seen nothing, meaning the killer had murdered and mutilated this woman with incredible speed and then escaped again without being seen. Catherine's throat was cut, her face was slashed in a way that seemed deliberately designed to destroy her features, and her abdomen was opened with multiple deep cuts. The killer had removed her left kidney and a major portion of her uterus, taking these organs with him when he left. The precision and speed of this butchery suggested not only anatomical knowledge, but also a calmness under pressure that seemed almost inhuman. The killer had worked in near-total darkness, in a location where he could have been discovered at any moment. Yet he had completed his terrible ritual and vanished before the policeman returned on his next patrol round. The double event created panic throughout London. If the killer could murder 2 women in one night, in different locations, and still escape undetected, then perhaps he really was the ghost or demon that some of the more sensational newspapers were suggesting. The investigation into these murders uncovered one piece of evidence that would become one of the most famous and controversial clues in the entire case. Shortly after Catherine Eddowes' body was discovered, a police officer found a piece of her blood-stained apron in a doorway on Golston Street, about 1/3 of a mile from Mitre Square. The killer had apparently used this piece of fabric to wipe his hands or his knife as he fled the scene. But more intriguing than the fabric itself was what the police found above it, written in white chalk on the black brickwork of the building. The message read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning of this message has been debated ever since. Was it written by the killer, or was it already there and coincidentally located near where he discarded the apron piece? The misspelling of Jews seemed deliberate, but why? Was the killer suggesting that Jewish people were responsible for the murders? Or was he being sarcastic, saying they would not be blamed? The message could be read multiple ways, and its actual meaning remains unclear. What happened next became one of the most controversial decisions in the entire investigation. Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of Police, arrived at the scene and ordered the writing to be rubbed out immediately before it could be photographed or properly documented. He feared that leaving the message visible would incite anti-Jewish riots in the East End, where tensions between immigrant and native populations already ran high. His decision meant that this potentially crucial piece of evidence was destroyed forever, and historians and investigators have been arguing about it ever since. The day after the double event, another letter arrived, this one even more disturbing than the first. It was written as a postcard and addressed to the Central News Agency again. The writer referred to himself as Saucy Jackie and mentioned the double event, describing it as a double event this time before the newspapers had even published that detail. He wrote that he had not had time to take the ears from one of the victims as he had promised in the earlier letter, but he had been interrupted. He signed his postcard with the name Jack the Ripper once again. The fact that the postcard mentioned the double event before it was widely known in the press suggested to some people that it might actually have come from the real killer. Those skeptics pointed out that journalists and police had been talking about the murders immediately after they happened, so someone determined to create a hoax could have learned the details quickly enough. The debate about whether any of the letters attributed to Jack the Ripper were genuine or all hoaxes has continued for more than a century, and there is no definitive answer. The most disturbing correspondence arrived in mid-October, addressed to George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local citizens who had organized to patrol the streets and put pressure on the police to solve the murders. This letter came in a small cardboard box and was accompanied by half of a human kidney preserved in wine. The letter, written in a barely literate scrawl quite different from the earlier correspondence, claimed to be from the killer and said he had taken the kidney from one of the victims and had fried and eaten the other half. The letter was signed From Hell, and it became known as the From Hell letter, one of the most chilling pieces of correspondence in criminal history. George Lusk took the kidney to a doctor, who examined it and determined it was indeed half of a human kidney that had been preserved in spirits of wine. The doctor believed it was a left kidney from an adult woman and showed evidence of a disease that Catherine et al. Had been known to have. This suggested the kidney really had come from her body, meaning the killer had indeed sent part of his victim through the mail as a grotesque taunt. However, other medical experts who examined the kidney were less certain, and some suggested it could have been a medical specimen stolen from a hospital or a university as part of an elaborate hoax. The truth about the kidney and the letter has never been definitively established, though many serious researchers believe this was the one piece of correspondence that genuinely came from the Ripper. By October, London was gripped by Ripper mania. The newspapers competed to publish the most shocking stories, often exaggerating or inventing details to sell more copies. Illustrations showed terrifying figures lurking in foggy streets, and headlines screamed about the failure of the police to catch the fiend. The residents of Whitechapel lived in constant fear. Women tried to avoid going out alone at night, though the poorest prostitutes had no choice but to continue working if they wanted to survive. Vigilante groups formed and patrolled the streets, sometimes harassing innocent people they suspected of being the killer. The police received hundreds of tips and accusations, investigating each one no matter how unlikely, but none led to the killer. Rumors spread wildly. Some people claimed the killer was a doctor from the West and who traveled to Whitechapel to commit his crimes before returning to his respectable life. Others insisted he was a foreign sailor who murdered women in different ports around the world. There were theories about escaped lunatics, about women-hating religious fanatics, about members of the royal family, and about secret societies conducting ritual murders. The atmosphere became so charged that several innocent people were nearly killed by mobs who became convinced they had found the Ripper. The pressure on the police was enormous, and the detectives working the case put in exhausting hours following leads that led nowhere. For more than a month after the double event, the murders stopped. The police maintained their increased patrols, and people began to hope that perhaps the killer had died or fled to another country, or been locked up for some other crime without anyone realizing he was the Ripper. But on November 9th, 1888, Jack the Ripper committed his final and most horrific murder, a crime so shockingly brutal that it stands apart from all the others. The victim was a young woman named Mary Jane Kelly, and unlike the previous victims who had been killed quickly on the street or in open spaces, Mary Jane was murdered indoors in her own small room, which gave the killer all the time he needed to fully express whatever dark compulsions drove him. Mary Jane Kelly was only 25 years old, much younger than the other victims, and by the standards of Whitechapel prostitutes, she was considered attractive and had better prospects than most. She lived in a single room at 13 Miller's Court, a narrow passage off Dorset Street. The room was tiny, just 12 feet square, and contained a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, and a fireplace. She lived there with a man named Joseph Barnett who worked at the docks, and they had been together as a couple for some time, an unusual arrangement that provided her with some stability. But Barnett had recently lost his job, and without money for rent, their relationship had become strained. They had argued, and he had moved out just days before her death, leaving Mary Jane alone and desperate for money. On the evening of November 8th, several people saw her in the area, drinking and looking for clients. Around 2 in the morning, a neighbor heard her singing in her room, suggesting she was still alive at that hour, and possibly that she had brought someone back with her. The next morning, November 9th, the landlord sent his assistant to collect the overdue rent. The assistant knocked on Mary Jane's door and received no answer. He looked through the window, which had a broken pane covered with an old coat, and what he saw made him run for the police immediately. When officers forced open the door, they found a scene of such devastating violence that even the most experienced detectives were shaken. Mary Jane Kelly had been systematically destroyed. The killer had spent hours with her body, cutting and mutilating in ways that suggested a complete loss of control or perhaps a deliberate attempt to obliterate her humanity entirely. Her throat had been cut down to the spine. Her face had been slashed beyond recognition. Her abdomen had been opened and emptied, with organs removed and placed around the room. The bed was soaked with blood, and pieces of flesh had been placed on the table. The fireplace had been filled with burning clothing, apparently to provide light for the killer to see what he was doing. The heat from the fire had been so intense that it had melted the spout of a kettle, suggesting the killer had burned substantial amounts of material, possibly including pieces of Mary Jane's body or clothing. The photographs taken of this crime scene, which still exist in police archives, remain among the most disturbing images in criminal history. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly marked a turning point in the case because it was so different from the others. The previous victims had been killed quickly on the street, with the killer working fast to avoid discovery. But with Mary Jane, he had taken his time indoors, giving free rein to whatever twisted impulses drove him. Some investigators theorized that this meant Mary Jane had known her killer and trusted him enough to bring him to her room. Others suggested the killer had been watching her and waiting for an opportunity to have a victim in a private place where he would not be interrupted. The level of rage or hatred or madness displayed in this murder seemed to surpass anything seen before. It was as if the killer had been building to this moment, as if all the previous murders had been rehearsals for this final, terrible performance. The police conducted an extensive investigation, questioning everyone who lived near Miller's Court and everyone who had seen Mary Jane in the days before her death. Several witnesses reported seeing her with a man that night, and their descriptions varied widely. Some described a young man, others an older one. Some said he looked respectable, while others thought he appeared shabby. The witnesses could not agree on height, hair color, or facial features, which suggested either that they had seen different men or that their memories were unreliable, shaped by fear and expectation rather than actual observation. After Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the police investigation reached a fever pitch. The Home Secretary demanded results, and Sir Charles Warren, already under heavy criticism for the failure to catch the killer, resigned from his position as Metropolitan Police Commissioner. The investigation was being led by several different police forces since some murders had occurred in Metropolitan Police territory, while Catherine Eddowes had been killed in the small area covered by the separate City of London Police. Inspector Frederick Aberline became the most prominent detective associated with the case, and he worked tirelessly interviewing witnesses, following up leads, and trying to make sense of the few clues available. The police compiled lists of potential suspects, ranging from known criminals to people who had been reported acting strangely in the Whitechapel area. They investigated butchers, doctors, sailors, foreigners, and anyone else who seemed even slightly suspicious. The problem was that too many people seemed suspicious in a neighborhood where poverty and desperation made strange behavior common, and where thousands of men passed through the streets every day. One of the difficulties the police faced was the lack of modern forensic techniques. In 1888, there was no fingerprint analysis, no DNA testing, no blood typing, and no scientific way to connect physical evidence to a specific person. The police had to rely on eyewitness testimony, which proved unreliable, and on catching the killer in the act or finding someone who knew him and would turn him in. The Ripper left almost no useful evidence behind. He apparently did not drop anything at the crime scenes that could identify him. He did not leave clear footprints or other traces that investigators could follow. The knife he used was probably a common type that hundreds or thousands of people in the area might own. The bloodstains on his clothing would have been hidden by the darkness and by the generally dirty condition of people's clothes in that neighborhood. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to commit his crimes at times and places where he would not be observed, suggesting either incredible luck or a good knowledge of police patrol patterns and the rhythms of street life in Whitechapel. The police also faced criticism for their handling of various aspects of the investigation. The decision to erase the chalk writing on Golston Street was widely condemned as destroying potential evidence. The failure to photograph crime scenes adequately meant that important details might have been missed or forgotten. The poor coordination between different police forces led to duplicated efforts and missed opportunities. Some witnesses were not interviewed promptly, and by the time police spoke with them, their memories had faded or been contaminated by newspaper reports and gossip. The press criticized the police constantly, suggesting they were incompetent or that the killer was being protected by influential people who did not want him exposed. Wild conspiracy theories flourished in this atmosphere of frustration and fear. Some people became convinced the government knew who the killer was but refused to arrest him for political reasons. Others believed the murders were being committed by a group rather than an individual, possibly as part of some ritual or criminal enterprise. The lack of progress in solving the case fed these theories and created an atmosphere of distrust between the public and the authorities. Over the years since the murders, dozens of people have been suggested as possible suspects for the Jack the Ripper murders. Some were investigated by the police at the time, while others have been proposed by later researchers and crime historians. Each suspect has had advocates who believe they have solved the case, but none has been proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, and the truth remains elusive. One of the earliest suspects was a man known as Leather Apron, whose real name was John Pizer. He was a boot finisher who wore a leather apron for his work and had a reputation for mistreating prostitutes. After the early murders, rumors spread that Leather Apron was responsible, and he was arrested and questioned by police. However, he had solid alibis for the times of the murders, and the police released him. He successfully sued several newspapers for libel after they published articles suggesting he was the killer. Another suspect who attracted serious police attention was a Polish-Jewish immigrant named Aaron Kosminski. He lived in Whitechapel and worked as a barber, but he suffered from mental illness and was eventually committed to an asylum where he spent the rest of his life. Some senior police officials, including Sir Robert Anderson and Inspector Donald Swanson, later wrote that they believed Kosminski was the Ripper, though they provided little concrete evidence for this belief beyond their suspicions and the fact that the murders stopped around the time Kosminski's mental state deteriorated and he was institutionalized. Modern researchers have attempted to connect Kosminski to the crimes through DNA analysis of a shawl supposedly found at one of the crime scenes. But this evidence has been heavily criticized by other experts who question both the chain of custody of the shawl and the methodology used in the DNA testing. A suspect named Montague John Druitt has also been frequently mentioned in connection with the murders. Druitt was a barrister and teacher who came from a middle-class family, making him an unlikely suspect for crimes committed in the East End slums. However, he suffered from depression and was dismissed from his teaching position in late November 1888, just weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. On December 31st, his body was found in the River Thames, an apparent suicide. His family believed he was going insane, and some speculated that guilt over the murders might have driven him to take his own life. Melville Macnaghten, who joined the Metropolitan Police as Assistant Chief Constable shortly after the murders ended, later wrote a memorandum in which he named Druitt as the most likely suspect, though Macnaghten had not been involved in the original investigation and appeared to be basing his opinion on rumors and speculation rather than solid evidence. Some theories have pointed to members of the royal family or the aristocracy, suggesting that the murders were committed to cover up a scandal or were the result of a conspiracy involving high-ranking individuals. The most famous of these theories involves Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, who supposedly had an affair with a working-class woman and whose associates murdered witnesses to protect the royal family from scandal. This theory has been thoroughly debunked by serious historians who have shown that Prince Albert Victor was nowhere near London during most of the murders and that the entire story was invented by people with no credible evidence. Nevertheless, the theory persists in popular culture because it suggests an explanation for why the case was never solved, implying that powerful people covered up the truth to protect one of their own. Other suspects have included a failed doctor named Francis Tumblety, an American quack who was in London during the murders and who was arrested for homosexual offenses before fleeing to the United States, and a man named Michael Ostrog, a Russian criminal who was on the police's radar because of his history of theft and deception. There is also speculation about a mysterious figure called the Batty Street Lodger, a man who supposedly stayed in lodgings near some of the murder sites and who disappeared around the time the murders stopped. Some researchers have suggested that the killer might have been a midwife or an abortionist, which would explain the anatomical knowledge and the focus on female victims, though this theory assumes the killer was a woman, which seems inconsistent with witness descriptions and the physical strength required for such violent attacks. A theory proposed by crime novelist Patricia Cornwell suggested that the killer was a painter named Walter Sickert, based on circumstantial evidence and analysis of letters supposedly sent by the Ripper, but this theory has been widely criticized by experts who found her evidence unconvincing and her methods questionable. The truth is that without modern forensic science, without clear eyewitness testimony, and without any confession or capture of the killer, the identity of Jack the Ripper cannot be determined with certainty. Every suspect has problems with the case against them, whether it is lack of firm evidence, solid alibis for some of the murders, or characteristics that do not match what little is known about the killer. The murder stopped suddenly after Mary Jane Kelly's death, with no clear explanation. Did the killer die or leave the country? Was he locked up in prison or an asylum for some other crime or condition? Did he simply decide to stop killing, his dark urges satisfied or his courage failing? These questions have no answers, and perhaps they never will. In all the fascination with Jack the Ripper, with trying to solve the mystery and identify the killer, the 5 women who died in the canonical Ripper murders are sometimes forgotten as individuals. They become simply victims, bodies in police reports, pieces of a puzzle rather than human beings who lived and loved and struggled before they met their terrible ends. But each of these women had a story, a life that was shaped by the harsh realities of Victorian England and by personal choices and circumstances that led them to be in Whitechapel on those fatal nights. Remembering them as people rather than just victims is an important part of understanding the full tragedy of these events. Mary Ann Nichols, the first victim, had once been a wife and mother with a stable family life. She had 5 children who loved her, and for years she had worked hard to keep her household running. But alcoholism and marital problems destroyed that life, leaving her to drift through the harsh world of the East End workhouses and lodging houses. Her children were grown and scattered by the time she died, unable to help her or perhaps unwilling to deal with her problems. She was trying to survive one day at a time, hoping to earn enough for a bed each night and some food the next day. On the night she died, she had been cheerful, showing off her new bonnet, confident she could earn what she needed. She had no way of knowing she was walking to her death. Annie Chapman, the second victim, had also fallen from better circumstances. Her husband had been a coachman, a respectable working-class position, and when they were together, she had lived in relative comfort. But after their separation and his death, she had lost that security. She suffered from chronic lung disease and malnutrition, her body weakened by years of poverty and hardship. Despite her health problems, she tried to earn money however she could, selling flowers and matches on the streets in addition to prostitution. She was staying in lodging houses where the keepers knew her and tried to be kind when they could, but business was business, and without the money for a bed, even familiar faces could not let her stay. Her children were alive, but could not or would not help her. She died alone in a backyard, killed by a stranger for reasons she could never have understood. Elizabeth Stride, the third victim and the first of the double event, had come to England from Sweden many years before her death. She had survived hardships that would have broken many people, including a disaster at sea that she claimed had killed her husband and children, though some records suggest this story may have been exaggerated or invented. She had worked various jobs and had several relationships with men who provided some support, but by the time of her death, she was living in a common lodging house and working the streets. She was known to be a heavy drinker, which sometimes made her quarrelsome, but other times left her happy and singing. On the night she died, witnesses had seen her with a man who was described as respectable-looking, wearing a flower in his buttonhole and speaking quietly with her. If she felt any fear, she did not show it to the people who saw her. Perhaps she thought this man would be an easy client, someone with money who would treat her decently. Instead, he cut her throat and left her bleeding in the dark. Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim and the second of the double event, had been in police custody just hours before her death, arrested for being drunk and disorderly, and held in a cell until she sobered up. When the police released her shortly after midnight, they had no idea they were sending her to her death. Catherine had lived a hard life, though she tried to maintain her dignity in her relationships. She had a partner named John Kelly who cared for her, and they had been together for several years, supporting each other as best they could through the constant struggle for survival. She earned money through casual prostitution and by cleaning or doing small jobs when she could find them. On the night she died, she needed money desperately and went looking for clients despite the danger everyone knew was lurking in the streets. She had told the police officers who released her that she would get a reward for identifying Jack the Ripper, a sad irony since she would instead become his victim less than 2 hours after walking free. She died quickly, probably with little understanding of what was happening, as the knife struck and her life ended in the darkness of Mitre Square. Mary Jane Kelly, the fifth and final canonical victim, was the youngest of the women at just 25 years old. She had been born in Ireland and had lived in Wales before coming to London. She was reported to have worked in a high-class brothel in the West End before ending up in Whitechapel, suggesting she had fallen from better circumstances, though the details of her earlier life are unclear and possibly embellished by stories she told about herself. She was known for her singing voice and for her beauty, which was remarkable in an area where poverty aged people quickly. She had a relationship with Joseph Barnett that seemed genuine, with both of them caring for each other despite their difficulties. When he lost his job and could no longer contribute to their rent, their relationship suffered, but they remained connected. On the night she died, she had been drinking heavily, possibly trying to drown her worries about money and her situation. Several people heard her singing in her room in the early morning hours, and then there was silence. Where her body was found the next day, the level of destruction was so complete that some people who knew her could not bear to look at what remained. She was buried in a cemetery in Leytonstone, with a large crowd of mourners attending her funeral, many of them other prostitutes from Whitechapel who understood that Mary Jane's fate could easily have been their own. As weeks and then months passed after Mary Jane Kelly's murder with no new killings that bore the Ripper's signature, the intense police investigation gradually wound down. The extra patrols in Whitechapel were reduced, and the detectives who had been working exclusively on the case were reassigned to other duties. The enormous public interest began to fade as newspapers moved on to other stories and people's attention shifted to other concerns. The case remained officially open, and any new murders of women in the East End were carefully examined to see if they might be connected to the Ripper, but none showed the same characteristics of throat cutting, abdominal mutilation, and organ removal that had marked the canonical 5 victims. Several murders occurred in the following years that some people attributed to Jack the Ripper, though most serious investigators did not believe they were connected. In July 1889, A woman named Alice Mackenzie was killed in Whitechapel in a manner that showed some similarities to the Ripper murders. But the medical examiner who had performed autopsies on several of the canonical victims stated that the knife work was different and less skilled, suggesting a different killer. In February 1891, a woman named Frances Coles was murdered in Whitechapel with her throat cut, but again the other signature elements of the Ripper crimes were absent. A man named James Sadler was arrested for that murder, and though he was eventually released due to lack of evidence, his arrest and the circumstances around Frances Coles's death convinced many people that she had not been a Ripper victim. Several other murders of women in London and in other parts of England in the years following 1888 were sometimes attributed to the Ripper by newspapers seeking sensational stories, but none showed the specific combination of characteristics that defined the Whitechapel murders. The police who worked the case eventually retired or moved to other positions, taking their knowledge and theories with them. Inspector Aberline, who had been the lead investigator during the height of the murders, continued to work for the Metropolitan Police until his retirement and then became a private detective. He gave occasional interviews about the case, but never publicly identified a specific suspect he believed was definitely the killer. In his private correspondence, he seemed to favor the theory that the Ripper had been a man who had since died or been institutionalized, which would explain why the murder stopped, but he acknowledged he had no proof. Sir Robert Anderson, who had been assistant commissioner during the murders, wrote in his memoirs that he believed the killer had been identified, but that the witness who could have confirmed it refused to testify because the suspect was a fellow Jew and the witness would not send another Jew to the gallows. This claim has been much debated, with some historians thinking Anderson was referring to Aaron Kosminski, while others believe he was confused or deliberately misleading. Melville Macnaghten, who was not involved in the original investigation but later reviewed the case files, wrote his private memorandum naming 3 suspects, with Montague Drip being his preferred choice, though his reasoning was never fully explained and seemed to be based on circumstantial evidence and suspicions rather than solid facts. As the years passed and everyone directly involved with the case died, the official files were sealed away in police archives and government repositories. The Metropolitan Police file was destroyed at some point, possibly deliberately or possibly through accident or administrative neglect, meaning that much of what the police knew and suspected was lost forever. Some documents survived in other archives, including Home Office files and City of London police records, and these have been extensively studied by researchers trying to understand what happened during those terrible months in 1888. But crucial information is missing, including detailed reports from some of the crime scenes, interviews with many witnesses, and the internal discussions among police officials about their suspects and theories. The destruction of these records has frustrated historians and researchers for generations, leaving gaps in our knowledge that can never be filled. While the official investigation faded, something else was happening that would ensure Jack the Ripper remained famous long after the actual crimes. The murders had captured the public imagination in a way that few crimes before them ever had, and that fascination did not end when the killing stopped. The name Jack the Ripper, whether it came from the real killer or from a hoax letter, had power that resonated through society. He became a symbol of many things, of the darkness lurking in modern cities, of the failure of progress to eliminate evil, of the vulnerability of women in a world that did not protect them, of mysteries that could not be solved no matter how much effort was applied. Within a few years, books were being written about the case, plays were being performed that featured Ripper-like characters, and the murders were becoming part of London folklore. The story of Jack the Ripper fit perfectly into the Victorian fascination with crime, mystery, and the Gothic. The foggy streets of Whitechapel became a literary setting representing danger and the unknown. The figure of the Ripper himself became an archetype, the gentleman killer who appeared respectable but hid monstrous evil beneath a civilized surface, or alternatively, the mad doctor or the deranged foreigner who brought violence into the heart of the empire. The victims became symbols rather than individuals, representing the fallen women of Victorian morality tales or the innocent victims of an uncaring society, depending on the political or social views of whoever was telling the story. The police became either tragic heroes doing their best in impossible circumstances or bumbling fools who let the killer escape, again, depending on the storyteller's perspective. The case had all the elements needed for lasting myth: brutal crimes, mysterious perpetrator, atmospheric setting, sudden unexplained ending, and enough ambiguity that people could project their own theories and interpretations onto the facts. As the 20th century progressed, Jack the Ripper became increasingly embedded in popular culture. He appeared in novels, movies, television shows, comic books, and every other form of entertainment and media. Sometimes the stories were attempts to seriously examine the historical case, but more often the Ripper became a character in fictional stories that used the name and the basic concept, but had little connection to the actual events of 1888. He fought Sherlock Holmes in stories, even though Arthur Conan Doyle's detective never investigated the real case. He became a time traveler, an alien, a supernatural entity, whatever the story needed him to be. The real women who died were forgotten in these fictional accounts, replaced by invented victims who served the needs of the plot. The historical details were altered or ignored to make more dramatic stories. The actual social conditions of Victorian Whitechapel were romanticized into something picturesque rather than horrific, with the grinding poverty and suffering turned into atmospheric background for murder mysteries. This transformation of real tragedy into entertainment has troubled many people who study the case seriously. The 5 women who died, and the real suffering they endured both in their deaths and in their lives leading up to those deaths, deserve to be remembered with respect rather than used as props in sensational stories. The real detectives who worked themselves to exhaustion trying to stop the killer deserve accurate recognition of their efforts rather than being caricatured as incompetent. The real social issues that the murders highlighted, including the treatment of women, the effects of extreme poverty, and the inadequacy of law enforcement methods in the face of a new type of crime, deserve serious examination rather than being obscured by myth and speculation. But the legend has taken on a life of its own, and Jack the Ripper, the cultural phenomenon, has become far more famous and influential than the actual unknown killer who murdered 5 women in London more than a century ago. As interest in the Jack the Ripper case continued through the 20th century and into the 21st, a whole field of study developed around trying to solve the mystery. People who specialize in researching the case have come to be called ripperologists, and they range from serious historians and researchers who carefully examine original documents and use sound historical methodology to amateur enthusiasts whose theories range from plausible to completely absurd. The serious researchers have made genuine contributions to understanding the case, uncovering documents that have been lost or overlooked, identifying witnesses who were not properly interviewed at the time, and bringing modern analytical techniques to bear on the historical evidence. They have published detailed books and articles that examine every aspect of the murders, the investigation, and the social context in which the crimes occurred. The problem is that the case attracts conspiracy theorists and people who become convinced they have solved the mystery based on flimsy evidence or wild speculation. Over the years, researchers have named dozens of suspects, each supposedly the definitive answer to the Ripper's identity. But none of these identifications has been universally accepted because none has been proven beyond reasonable doubt. Some theories are based on careful historical research and make a plausible case for a particular suspect, but plausibility is not the same as proof, and without a confession, capture, or definitive forensic evidence, no theory can be confirmed. Other theories are based on circumstantial coincidences, misinterpreted evidence, or deliberate distortion of facts to fit a predetermined conclusion. The field of ripperology has developed a somewhat poor reputation among mainstream historians because of these problems, though the best ripperologists do work that meets rigorous academic standards. One of the ongoing debates among serious researchers concerns which murders should actually be attributed to Jack the Ripper. The 5 canonical victims, Marion Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, are generally agreed upon because they share similar characteristics and occur during the same time period in the same area. But some researchers argue that Elizabeth Stride should not be included because her body was not mutilated like the others, suggesting she might have been killed by someone else entirely. Some researchers want to add other murders that occurred before or after the canonical five, arguing that they show similar characteristics or that the Ripper's methods might have evolved over time. Without knowing who the killer was, it is impossible to say definitively which murders he committed. So this debate continues with different experts holding different opinions based on how they interpret the evidence. Modern technology has been applied to the case in various ways, usually with disappointing results. DNA analysis has been attempted on items supposedly from the crime scenes, but the chain of custody for these items is often questionable, meaning we cannot be sure they actually came from the victims or the killer, and the samples are contaminated by more than a century of handling by multiple people. The famous shawl, supposedly from Catherine Eddowes' murder scene, has been subjected to DNA testing that one researcher claims proves the killer was Aaron Kosminski. But other scientists have strongly criticized the methodology and questioned whether the shawl actually came from the crime scene at all. Geographic profiling, a modern technique that analyzes crime scene locations to determine where a serial killer likely lives, has been applied to the Ripper murders and suggests the killer probably lived in the heart of Whitechapel. But this does not narrow down the suspects much since thousands of people lived in that area. Psychological profiling has been used to create portraits of what kind of person the Ripper might have been. But these profiles are general enough to fit many different individuals and specific enough that they could be completely wrong if the killer's psychology was unusual or if he defies the patterns that modern profilers expect. One of the most significant impacts of the Jack the Ripper murders was the attention they brought to the terrible living conditions in London's East End. The crimes occurred at a time when British society was beginning to confront the reality that industrialization and empire had created enormous wealth for some people while leaving others in devastating poverty. Social reformers had been working to document and publicize the conditions in the slums, but most comfortable middle-class and upper-class people preferred not to think about such unpleasant matters. The Ripper murders forced this issue into public consciousness because suddenly everyone was reading about Whitechapel and learning about how people live there. The victims were described in newspaper articles that detailed their desperate circumstances, living in flop houses for pennies a night, unable to earn enough money through legitimate work to survive, driven to prostitution as the only way to keep themselves from starving or freezing on the streets. This put a human face on poverty in a way that statistical reports and reformer speeches could not. The murders also highlighted the vulnerability of women in Victorian society and the lack of protections available to the poorest women especially. Prostitution was illegal, but the police generally tolerated it while occasionally arresting women to keep up appearances. The prostitutes had no legal protections and could be abused by clients or police with little recourse. If they were killed, the investigations were often perfunctory since their lives were not valued as highly as those of respectable women. The Ripper case changed this somewhat because the sheer horror of the murders created sympathy even for victims who otherwise would have been dismissed as immoral unfortunates who brought their fates upon themselves. The newspapers published stories about the women's lives that showed they were human beings who had been driven to desperate circumstances by poverty, alcoholism, failed relationships, and lack of opportunities. This created some public pressure for better services for poor women, for homeless shelters, for job training programs, and for reforms to prostitution laws that focused on helping women rather than just punishing them. In the years following the murders, some reforms were implemented in the East End. Housing conditions began to improve slowly as old slums were torn down and replaced with slightly better accommodations. Charitable organizations expanded their services, opening more shelters and soup kitchens. The police increased their presence in the area permanently, not just during crisis periods. The publicity around the murders had made it impossible for the government and society to continue ignoring the East End's problems. Though the changes came slowly and many people continued to suffer for decades afterward. Some historians argue that the Ripper murders were a catalyst that helped accelerate social reforms that were already beginning, bringing urgent attention to issues that reformers had been working on for years with limited success. The murders showed that ignoring poverty and suffering created dangers not just for the poor, but potentially for all of society, a lesson that helped motivate action. The case also had a significant impact on criminal investigation methods. The police had been overwhelmed by the Ripper case, partly because they lacked systematic procedures for dealing with serial killers, a type of criminal that was not well understood at the time. One category of theories focuses on suspects who were investigated by the police at the time. Aaron Kosminski remains a favorite suspect for many researchers because senior police officials mentioned him in their memoirs, and because he was a Whitechapel resident with mental health problems who was institutionalized around the time the murders stopped. However, the evidence against him is largely circumstantial, consisting mainly of the suspicions of officers who investigated the case rather than solid proof. The supposed DNA evidence from the controversial shawl has not convinced most experts because of questions about the shawl's authenticity and the reliability of the testing. Montague Druitt is another police-era suspect who continues to attract attention because of his suicide shortly after the murders ended. But there is no clear evidence connecting him to the crimes beyond Macnaghten's suspicions, and his background as a middle-class barrister and teacher makes it hard to understand why he would have been in Whitechapel committing murders. Michael Ostrog, the third suspect Macnaghten named, has been largely dismissed by modern researchers who found that his criminal record showed he was not in London during the murders. Another category of theories involves suspects who were not known to police at the time, but who have been proposed by later researchers based on historical investigation. Francis Tumblety, the American quack doctor, has attracted support from some researchers who note that he was in London during the murders, that he had a hatred of women, particularly prostitutes, and that he fled to America after being arrested for homosexual offenses, which might suggest he was fleeing murder charges rather than the lesser offense. However, witnesses described the man seen with some victims as being shorter and younger than Tumblety, who was tall and in his 50s, and there is no clear evidence placing him at any of the crime scenes. A suspect named James Maybrick, a cotton merchant from Liverpool, was proposed based on a diary that surfaced in the 1990s claiming to be his confession to the Ripper murders. However, most experts who have examined this diary believe it is a modern forgery, and Maybrick himself does not fit the profile of the killer in several important ways, including the fact that he lived in Liverpool, not London. Some of the most controversial theories involve high-ranking or famous people. The royal conspiracy theory, which suggests that the murders were connected to Prince Albert Victor or were committed to cover up a royal scandal, has been thoroughly debunked by historians who have shown that the supposed evidence was fabricated or misinterpreted and that the prince was not in London during most of the murders. Nevertheless, this theory remains popular in fiction and with conspiracy theorists because it provides a dramatic explanation for why the case was never solved, suggesting a massive cover-up by the establishment. The theory that the killer was the painter Walter Sickert, proposed by Patricia Cornwell, has been heavily criticized by both art historians and Ripper experts who found her evidence unconvincing and her conclusions unsupported by the facts. The theory that the killer was Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, based on supposed coded messages in his writings, has been dismissed as absurd by serious researchers. Some theories propose that the killer was not a man at all, but a woman, possibly a midwife or an abortionist who had anatomical knowledge and who could move through the streets without attracting suspicion because women were not viewed as potential threats. This theory attempts to explain why witnesses who saw people near the crime scenes did not report seeing obviously suspicious men and why the killer could approach female victims without alarming them. However, the theory struggles with the physical evidence of the crimes, which suggests considerable physical strength was used, particularly in the case of Mary Jane Kelly, where the body was extensively mutilated over several hours. Most experts believe the killer was male based on the nature of the crimes and the few witness descriptions that exist. Still, other theories suggest that multiple killers might have been involved, either working together or committing separate murders that were mistakenly attributed to a single perpetrator. This would explain some of the inconsistencies in witness descriptions and some of the differences between the murders. However, the similarities in method, particularly the throat cutting and abdominal mutilation, strongly suggest a single killer developed a signature pattern that he repeated. The sudden stop in the murders after Mary Jane Kelly also suggests a single person rather than multiple killers who would be unlikely to all stop at the same time. The multiple killer theory solves some problems, but creates others, and most serious researchers believe a single perpetrator is more likely. The question of why Jack the Ripper has remained so famous, while other historical crimes have been forgotten, is worth considering. There were other serial killers before and after the Ripper whose crimes were equally brutal or who killed more victims, yet few of them have achieved the same lasting notoriety. Part of the answer lies in timing and location. The murders occurred at a moment when newspapers were becoming mass media, reaching more people than ever before, and when literacy rates were high enough that most people could read these papers. London was the largest city in the world and the center of a global empire, so news from London traveled everywhere. The murders happened in a time and place where they could receive maximum attention and be widely discussed and debated. The name Jack the Ripper itself contributed to the legend. It was memorable, combining the common name Jack with the violent word Ripper in a way that was both ordinary and terrifying. The mystery of the killer's identity has proven irresistible to people who love puzzles and want to solve them. Unlike cases where the perpetrator was caught and tried and became just another criminal, the Ripper's unknown identity allows people to project whatever image they want onto him, making him a blank slate for fears and theories. The fact that the murders stopped suddenly and without explanation adds to the mystery, creating a story with no satisfying conclusion and leaving people wanting answers that will never come. The Victorian setting also contributes to the lasting fascination. The contrast between the rigid social conventions and the savage murders creates dramatic tension. The foggy streets and gaslit alleys of Whitechapel have become iconic settings that represent mystery and danger. The social divisions of Victorian London, with extreme wealth and extreme poverty existing side by side, create a rich backdrop for the story. Modern audiences find the Victorian era both familiar enough to understand and foreign enough to be exotic, making it an appealing setting for historical mysteries. The fact that the Ripper story involves actual historical events rather than pure fiction gives it an authenticity and weight that fictional mysteries cannot match. The human tendency to create and share stories about frightening things also plays a role in keeping the legend alive. Jack the Ripper serves as a boogeyman figure, a personification of random violence and evil that can strike without warning. Sharing stories about him becomes a way of processing fears about crime and danger in a safe context. Each generation reinterprets the Ripper story through its own concerns and anxieties, making him relevant to contemporary issues while maintaining the historical framework. In the Victorian era, he represented fears about modernity and urban life. In the 20th century, he became a symbol of sexual violence against women and the failure of authorities to protect the vulnerable. In the current era, he represents unsolved mysteries and the limits of forensic science and investigation. The case has also benefited from serious scholarly attention over the decades. Historians, criminologists, and other researchers have produced detailed studies of the murders, the investigation, and the social context, creating a substantial body of literature that keeps the case in public awareness. Museums have exhibitions about the Ripper. Walking tours guide visitors through Whitechapel following the route of the murders, and academic conferences bring together researchers to discuss new theories and evidence. This ongoing scholarly activity ensures that Jack the Ripper remains part of historical discourse, rather than fading into obscurity like other old crimes that are no longer studied or discussed. Looking at the Jack the Ripper case from a modern perspective reveals some uncomfortable truths about Victorian society and about how the case has been remembered and discussed. The victims were poor women who had been failed by their society long before they encountered the killer. They lived in a world that offered women few opportunities to support themselves honestly and then condemned them as immoral when they turned to prostitution to survive. They lived in conditions of such desperate poverty that they could not afford a bed for the night and had to risk their lives going with strangers in the dark just to earn a few pennies. They had families who could not or would not help them, husbands who had left them, children they could not care for, and illnesses they could not afford to treat. The murders were the final tragedy in lives that had been tragic long before the killer found them. Modern feminism has brought attention to the way the victims have been treated in the historical narrative of the Ripper case. For too long, they were dismissed as mere prostitutes whose deaths were less important than solving the mystery of who killed them. Their humanity was overlooked in favor of focusing on the identity and psychology of the killer, making them props in someone else's story rather than people worthy of respect and remembrance. Efforts have been made in recent years to correct this imbalance, to tell the victims' stories and honor their memory, to recognize that they were daughters and mothers and sisters who mattered to people and who deserved better than what life and death gave them. Memorials have been created, and some writers and researchers have focused specifically on recovering the victims' stories from historical records and giving them the dignity of being remembered as individuals rather than as a collective group of unfortunates. The case also raises questions about society's fascination with serial killers and violent crime. The entertainment industry has made the Ripper into a character in countless stories, and murder tourism brings visitors to Whitechapel to walk the routes where women died terribly. Is this respectful remembrance and historical education? Or is it a form of exploitation that turns real suffering into entertainment? There is no easy answer to this question, and different people have different views. Some argue that maintaining interest in historical crimes keeps important social lessons alive and honors victims by ensuring they are not forgotten. Others argue that the sensationalization of murder and the glamorization of killers are harmful and disrespectful to victims and their families. Both perspectives have merit, and finding the right balance between historical education and respectful remembrance remains challenging. Modern psychology has attempted to analyze Jack the Ripper based on the evidence of his crimes, creating profiles of what kind of person he might have been. These profiles suggest he was likely a local man who knew Whitechapel well, that he was probably not obviously mad, but could function normally in society, that he felt a deep hatred or rage toward women or specifically toward prostitutes, and that he might have suffered some traumatic experience or had some psychological disturbance that triggered his violence. The increasing brutality of the murders, particularly the Mary Jane Kelly murder, where he had time and privacy to fully indulge his impulses, suggests an escalating loss of control or a growing boldness. The fact that the murders stopped suddenly might indicate he died, was imprisoned, was institutionalized, or experienced some other life change that prevented him from continuing. However, all of these are speculations based on general patterns observed in other serial killers, and the Ripper might have been different from these patterns in important ways. Over the decades, Jack the Ripper has become not just a historical mystery, but a commercial phenomenon, an entire industry built around his crimes. In London, numerous businesses cater to Ripper tourism, offering walking tours that visit the murder sites, pub tours that combine historical information with drinks at Victorian-era taverns, and even theatrical experiences that recreate the atmosphere of Whitechapel in 1888. Museums display artifacts supposedly connected to the crimes, though the authenticity of some items is questionable. Souvenir shops sell Ripper-themed merchandise, from books and postcards to more macabre items like replica weapons or clothing. This commercialization has made the Ripper into a brand, a marketable product that attracts tourists and generates revenue for businesses and the local economy. The publishing industry has produced hundreds of books about Jack the Ripper, ranging from serious historical studies to wild speculative theories to fictional stories that use the Ripper as a character. Every few years, a new book appears claiming to finally reveal the Ripper's identity, generating publicity and sales before inevitably failing to convince experts and being relegated to the pile of interesting but unproven theories. The appetite for Ripper content seems inexhaustible, with readers continuing to buy books about a case that is more than a century old and will likely never be definitively solved. Publishers know that a Ripper book will find an audience, making it an attractive project despite the crowded field. The film and television industries have been equally productive, creating countless adaptations and interpretations of the Ripper story. Some productions attempt historical accuracy and serious examination of the case, while others use the Ripper name and concept as a springboard for pure fiction that has little connection to the actual events. The Ripper has been portrayed as everything from a supernatural monster to a criminal mastermind to a victim of his own madness, depending on what story the filmmakers want to tell. These portrayals have shaped public perception of the case, often more than historical facts have, creating an image of Jack the Ripper in popular culture that may bear little resemblance to whoever actually committed the murders. This commercialization and fictionalization raises ethical questions about the appropriateness of profiting from historical tragedy and about the responsibility of creators to respect the real people who suffered and died. Some people argue that the Ripper industry is ghoulish and disrespectful, turning murder victims into tourist attractions and entertainment products. Others argue that the commercial activity keeps the history alive and brings attention to important social issues about poverty, women's rights, and criminal justice that remain relevant today. The debate continues, with no clear consensus on where the line should be drawn between legitimate historical interest and exploitative commercialization. Despite the failure to catch Jack the Ripper, the case had a lasting positive impact on how serious crimes are investigated. The Ripper murders helped establish the concept of the serial killer as a distinct type of criminal who required special investigative approaches. Before the Ripper, most murders were assumed to be personal, with the killer and victim knowing each other and the motive being obvious things like robbery, revenge, or passion. The idea that someone might kill strangers repeatedly without any apparent motive was difficult for Victorian police to understand and investigate. The Ripper case forced law enforcement to develop new methods for dealing with this type of crime. One important development was the recognition that multiple seemingly unrelated murders might be connected and should be investigated as a series rather than as separate incidents. This seems obvious now, but was not standard practice in the 1880s. The police learned to look for patterns in how victims were selected and killed, in the locations where crimes occurred, and in the timing of incidents. They developed the concept of a killer's signature, specific unusual behaviors or mutilations that identify crimes as being committed by the same person. These analytical approaches would later become standard tools in criminal investigation and would be refined and improved by later generations of detectives. The Ripper case also highlighted the importance of preserving crime scenes and documenting them carefully. The photography of crime scenes was still relatively new in the 1880s, and the Ripper case was one of the first where photographs were systematically taken of bodies and locations. While the photography was not as comprehensive as modern standards would require, it represented an important step toward treating crime scenes as sources of evidence that needed to be recorded before they were disturbed. The case also showed the value of medical expertise in criminal investigations, with the police relying heavily on the doctors who performed autopsies to provide information about the killer's methods and possible characteristics. The forensic pathology field would develop significantly in the following decades, partly motivated by cases like the Ripper murders where medical evidence was crucial. The use of the press to communicate with the public and gather information also evolved during the Ripper investigation. The police issued appeals through newspapers asking for witnesses to come forward and describing suspects they wanted to question. They released some information about the crimes to warn potential victims while holding back other details that only the killer would know, a technique still used today to filter false confessions. The relationship between police and press was often contentious during the Ripper case, with newspapers criticizing the police and sometimes publishing information that interfered with the investigation, but both sides learned lessons about how to work together more effectively in future cases. The concept of using media to help solve crimes became firmly established and would later evolve into sophisticated strategies for managing public information during major investigations. Beyond its impact on criminal investigation, the Jack the Ripper case teaches important lessons about society and human nature that remain relevant today. The murders exposed the terrible conditions in which the poorest members of Victorian society lived and the inadequacy of social support systems for people who fell through the cracks. The 5 women who died were not criminals in any meaningful sense, but were people who had been failed by their society and left with no good options for survival. Their deaths brought attention to problems that should have been addressed long before a killer made them impossible to ignore. This lesson about social responsibility and the consequences of ignoring poverty and suffering applies in every era, including our own. The case also demonstrates how prejudice and assumption can interfere with seeking truth. During the Ripper investigation, various groups were scapegoated based on stereotypes rather than evidence. Jewish immigrants, particularly those from Eastern Europe, faced suspicion and hostility because they were foreign and different, and because anti-Semitic prejudice was strong in that era. Several innocent Jewish men were attacked by mobs convinced they had found the Ripper based on nothing more than ethnic prejudice. The police received numerous tips accusing foreigners, suggesting the killer must be someone from outside respectable English society rather than confronting the possibility that he might be an ordinary Englishman. This tendency to blame the other, to assume that terrible crimes must be committed by outsiders or by people who are somehow fundamentally different from us, is a pattern that repeats throughout history and remains a problem in modern society. The failure to solve the case despite considerable effort and public pressure demonstrates the limits of even the best-intentioned authorities. The police who investigated the Ripper murders were not incompetent or lazy, but were hard-working professionals who did their best with the tools and knowledge available to them. They were hampered by lack of forensic technology, by the killer's caution and cunning, by the difficulty of working in a neighborhood where poverty and crime were common, and by simple bad luck. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, criminals escape justice and mysteries remain unsolved. This is an uncomfortable truth that people often resist accepting, preferring to believe that justice will always prevail and that good will always triumph over evil. The Ripper case reminds us that the world is more complicated and uncertain than we would like it to be. The lasting fascination with the case reflects something deep in human psychology about our relationship with fear and mystery. People are drawn to scary stories because engaging with fear in a safe context helps us process anxiety about real dangers in the world. The Ripper serves as a personification of random violence, the nightmare that anyone could be a victim of terrible crime without warning or reason. By studying the case and discussing theories about the killer's identity, people create a sense of control over something that was fundamentally uncontrolled and chaotic. If we can understand who the Ripper was and why he killed, then perhaps we can protect ourselves from similar dangers. Of course, this sense of control is largely illusory, but it serves a psychological purpose that explains why the case continues to fascinate people more than a century after the murders occurred. In recent years, there has been increasing effort to ensure that the 5 women who died in the Ripper murders are remembered as people rather than as merely victims in a famous case. Historians and researchers have worked to uncover details about their lives, their personalities, their relationships, and their struggles. Memorial services have been held on anniversaries of their deaths. Plaques and markers have been placed in Whitechapel to honor their memory. Some people leave flowers at the sites where the women died, paying respect to individuals whose lives mattered even if the world did not properly value them when they were alive. These efforts represent a shift in how the case is understood, moving away from focusing exclusively on the mystery of the killer's identity and toward recognizing the humanity of those who suffered and died. The victim's legacy also includes the social reforms that were partially motivated by the attention the murders brought to East End poverty. The improvements in housing, the expansion of social services, the gradual recognition that society has responsibility to help its most vulnerable members rather than simply punishing them for their poverty. All of these changes were accelerated by the shock and sympathy the murders created. The women died terrible deaths, but their deaths were not completely meaningless if they helped bring about changes that improved lives for others who came after them. This does not justify or excuse what happened to them, but it does mean that some good came from tragedy, that their suffering was not entirely in vain. The case also contributed to changing attitudes about women and about violence against women. The brutality of the Ripper murders shocked Victorian society in part because, despite the prevalence of violence against women, the level of savagery was unprecedented. The murders could not be dismissed as domestic disputes or unfortunate accidents, but were clearly acts of pure hatred and violence directed specifically at women. This forced some people to confront the reality that women, particularly poor women, lived in constant danger and had few protections. While changing social attitudes is always a slow process, the Ripper case contributed to growing movements for women's rights and for better legal protections against violence. The victims became symbols, though not always in ways they might have chosen, for broader struggles for justice and equality. Each of the 5 women left behind people who loved them and mourned them. Mary and Nichols's children lost their mother, whatever the complications of their relationship had been. Annie Chapman's family grieved for her despite the difficult circumstances of her final years. Elizabeth Stride's friends remembered her singing and her strength in surviving hardships. Catherine Eddowes' partner John Kelly was devastated by her death and testified at her inquest with obvious emotion. Mary Jane Kelly's partner, Joseph Barnett, identified her body, a terrible task that must have haunted him. These personal connections remind us that the victims were real people embedded in networks of relationships, not isolated unfortunates without anyone who cared about them. Their deaths created ripples of grief that extended beyond the immediate horror of the murders themselves. More than 13 decades after the murders, people continue to search for Jack the Ripper's identity with remarkable persistence. New theories appear regularly, new suspects are proposed, and new evidence or new interpretations of old evidence are presented. Advances in forensic science raise hopes that DNA analysis or other modern techniques might finally solve the case. Though so far these hopes have been disappointed by the poor quality of the surviving evidence and the contamination that occurs when items are handled over many years. Researchers continue to explore archives looking for documents that might have been overlooked, hoping to find some crucial piece of information that will crack the case. The search has become its own phenomenon, almost independent of whether the mystery can actually be solved. Some people argue that the search should continue because the victims deserve justice, and because solving famous cold cases might encourage others not to give up on seemingly impossible investigations. They believe that determination and new technology will eventually reveal the truth. Others argue that the search has become obsessive and unhealthy, that the case will never be solved with certainty, and that it would be better to accept this and move on rather than continuing to dig through the same evidence hoping for different results. Both perspectives have merit, and the search continues regardless, driven by people who cannot let go of the mystery or who believe they have unique insights that others have missed. The reality is that without a remarkable discovery, such as a completely authentic contemporary confession or diary that can be verified beyond doubt, the identity of Jack the Ripper will remain unknown. Too much time has passed, too much evidence has been lost or destroyed, too many potential witnesses have died without leaving records of what they knew. The case exists in a historical fog that grows thicker rather than clearer as more time passes. New theories and suspects may be interesting and plausible, but plausibility is not the same as proof, and the standard of proof required to definitively identify the killer is very high. Most serious researchers acknowledge that absolute certainty is impossible, though they may have personal opinions about which suspect seems most likely based on the available evidence. The question then becomes whether the continuing fascination with the case is valuable or harmful. Does it keep important historical and social lessons alive, or does it trivialize real suffering by turning tragedy into an endless puzzle game? Does it honor the victims by ensuring they are not forgotten, or does it dishonor them by making them supporting characters in someone else's story? Does the academic and amateur research contribute to understanding history and criminal psychology, or does it waste resources that could be better spent on modern unsolved cases where justice might still be achieved? These are difficult questions with no clear answers, and reasonable people can disagree about the value and ethics of continuing to study and discuss a case that is so old and so unlikely to be definitively solved. The image of Jack the Ripper in popular culture has evolved over the decades, reflecting changing social attitudes and fears while maintaining certain core elements that make the character recognizable. In early portrayals from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Ripper was often depicted as a shadowy figure in a top hat and cape, a gentleman gone mad, reflecting Victorian anxieties about hidden evil beneath respectable appearances. As the 20th century progressed and social attitudes became more complex, portrayals became more varied. Some works depicted the Ripper sympathetically as a tortured soul driven to murder by madness or past trauma. Others made him a monster, emphasizing the brutal violence of the crimes. Still others used the Ripper name for stories that had little to do with the historical case, making him a general symbol of murder and mystery. The character has appeared in every form of media imaginable. In literature, the Ripper has been featured in detective novels where fictional investigators succeed where the real police failed, in horror stories where he becomes a supernatural threat, in science fiction where he travels through time or turns out to be an alien, and in alternative history where his identity being discovered or remaining hidden changes the course of events. In film and television, he has been the subject of historical dramas, thrillers, horror movies, and even comedies. Some of these portrayals attempt accuracy and seriousness, while others are purely exploitative or absurd. The sheer volume of cultural production around Jack the Ripper is staggering, with new works appearing constantly that add to the vast collection of Ripper-related content. This cultural presence has had the effect of making Jack the Ripper more famous than almost any other criminal in history, yet it has also distorted understanding of the actual case. Most people's knowledge of the Ripper comes from fictional portrayals rather than from historical facts, and they may believe things about the case that are not true because they appeared in movies or novels. The foggy Victorian London of popular imagination is more atmospheric and gothic than the real Whitechapel was. The Ripper himself has become a sophisticated monster or a tormented antihero in many portrayals, when the real killer was probably a disturbed individual driven by impulses that most people would find comprehensible only in the sense that mental illness and violent crime exist in every era. The victims are often reduced to types or forgotten entirely in stories that focus on the killer or on the detectives pursuing him. Some modern portrayals have tried to correct these problems by focusing on the victims or by presenting the case more accurately and critically. These works attempt to show the social conditions that created the environment for the murders, to honor the women who died as individuals, and to explore the case without sensationalizing or romanticizing the violence. Whether these more thoughtful approaches will change how the broader culture thinks about Jack the Ripper remains to be seen, as the sensational and dramatic versions continue to be more popular and commercially successful. The tension between historical responsibility and entertainment value is difficult to resolve, and different creators make different choices about where to place their emphasis. The story of Jack the Ripper is ultimately a story about human darkness, about the capacity for cruelty and violence that exists within some people, and about how society responds when that darkness is unleashed. It is also a story about human weakness, about how poverty and lack of opportunity can trap people in desperate circumstances, about how social systems fail to protect the vulnerable, and about the limitations of justice and law enforcement when confronted with a clever or lucky criminal. But it is also a story about human resilience and determination, about detectives who worked exhausting hours trying to stop a killer, about ordinary people who banded together to protect their neighborhood, and about a society that, however imperfectly, began to address the terrible conditions that the murders exposed. The 5 women who died, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, deserve to be at the center of any telling of this story. They were not merely victims in a famous mystery, but human beings who lived and struggled and tried to survive in a world that offered them little help or compassion. Their lives before they met the killer were filled with hardship, with brief moments of happiness overshadowed by constant worry about money and shelter and survival. They had families and friends, hopes and disappointments, strengths and weaknesses like all people. They deserved better than what life gave them, and far better than the terrible deaths they suffered. Remembering them as individuals rather than as a collective group of unfortunates is important for honoring their humanity and for understanding the full tragedy of what happened in Whitechapel in 1888. The killer himself, whoever he was, represents something that humanity has struggled to understand throughout history. What makes a person capable of such violence? Is it madness or evil, or some combination of psychology and circumstance that creates a monster? The debate continues among psychologists, criminologists, and philosophers about the nature of violent crime and whether such criminals can be understood through science or whether they represent something beyond normal understanding. Jack the Ripper offers no answers to these questions because his identity remains unknown and his motives died with him. He is a blank slate onto which people project their theories and fears, a symbol rather than a fully realized person. This makes him useful for discussions about crime and human nature, but also means that many of the lessons people claim to draw from the case say more about those drawing them than about the historical reality. The failure to catch Jack the Ripper has become as much a part of the legend as the murders themselves. In most crime stories, justice is eventually served and the criminal is punished, providing a satisfying conclusion that reaffirms faith in law and order. The Ripper case offers no such satisfaction. The killer escaped, the case remains unsolved, and justice was never achieved for the victims. This uncomfortable fact challenges the narratives people like to believe about how the world works. It suggests that sometimes evil triumphs, that good does not always win, and that despite our best efforts, some mysteries remain unsolved and some wrongs remain unpunished. This is a hard truth to accept, which is one reason why people keep trying to solve the case, seeking the closure that history did not provide. Jack the Ripper stepped out of the fog of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, committed terrible crimes over a period of a few short months, and then disappeared back into the darkness, leaving behind a mystery that has fascinated the world for more than a century. His identity remains unknown despite countless investigations and theories. The women he killed have been remembered, though often imperfectly and sometimes overshadowed by fascination with their murderer. The case changed criminal investigation and brought attention to social problems that needed addressing, creating some positive legacy from tragedy. But the core mystery remains unsolved, and the shadow of those murders continues to haunt the historical imagination. The East End of London has changed dramatically since 1888. The old slums were torn down. The poverty that defined Whitechapel in the Victorian era has been replaced by gentrification and development, and the streets where the murders occurred now look nothing like they did when Jack the Ripper walked them. Modern buildings stand where ancient tenements once crowded together. Businesses and apartments occupy spaces that were once flophouses and factories. The area has been transformed by more than a century of change, yet the memory of those terrible months persists. Markers indicate where the bodies were found. Tour guides lead groups through the area telling the story of the murders, and the Ripper's presence lingers as a historical ghost that continues to attract attention and fascination. The case reminds us that history is not just about great leaders and major events, but also about ordinary people caught in tragic circumstances and about crimes and mysteries that capture imagination across generations. It teaches us about Victorian society, about the treatment of women, about poverty and its consequences, about the development of criminal investigation, and about how societies respond to shocking crimes. It also teaches us about ourselves, about why we are drawn to mysteries and frightened by violent crime, about how we create legends from historical events, and about the human need to find meaning and resolution even when none exists. The story of Jack the Ripper is a mirror reflecting both the Victorian era and our own time, showing us things about human nature that are uncomfortable but important to acknowledge. More than 13 decades have passed since those autumn nights when fear gripped Whitechapel and a killer stalked the dark streets. Everyone who was alive during those events has long since died. The world has changed in ways the Victorians could never have imagined. Yet Jack the Ripper remains famous, his name instantly recognizable around the globe. The mystery endures because it speaks to something fundamental about crime and justice, about good and evil, about the known and the unknown. The 5 women who died are part of history now, their tragic deaths ensuring they will never be forgotten even though their lives were lived in obscurity and poverty. The killer, whoever he was, achieved a fame he may have sought or may have never wanted, becoming more myth than man, a symbol of terror and mystery that transcends the specific historical moment when the crimes occurred. This is the entire story of Jack the Ripper, a story with no ending, a mystery with no solution, a legend born from real tragedy and kept alive by genuine human fascination with the darkest aspects of our nature. The shadow that fell over Whitechapel in 1888 has never truly lifted, and perhaps it never will. The women who died deserve to be remembered. The society that failed them deserves to be examined. The killer who took their lives will probably never be identified with certainty. And the mystery will continue to haunt us, generation after generation. As long as people are drawn to unsolved puzzles, and as long as we struggle to understand how human beings can be capable of such terrible darkness. Jack the Ripper walked away into the fog and never returned, but his shadow remains, and it will remain as long as this story continues to be told.